The wind rolled over the plains like a sigh too old to remember where it came from. Dust lifted in lazy spirals around the dry boots of Samuel Colton, the solitary farmer who hadn't heard another man's voice in weeks, unless you counted the drunk echoes in his own head when he sat by the cold stove at night, turning a chipped tin cup between calloused hands. Samuel's land lay on the edge of what folks in town called the dying ground, too far from the river, too dry for wheat, too close to the old tribal lands the government kept redrawing on yellowed maps nobody trusted. But for a man who'd buried his wife under the only oak tree for 50 miles and watched his cattle wither in the sun, there wasn't much reason to leave. The land was as stubborn and parched as he was, and that was enough. He spent his mornings walking the fence line, hammering boards back into place more out of habit than hope. At dusk, he'd sit on the porch with his boots propped up on an old crate, watching the horizon bleed into the dirt. Some nights he'd see distant campfires flickering like lonely stars. He knew the tribal people still moved through the low hills, but they'd kept their distance since the last skirmish, the one that left the local garrison bragging about pacifying the savages. Samuel didn't believe in pacifying men whose land you'd stolen. He believed in leaving them be. It was near one of those low hills, 3 days into a pointless search for a stray calf, that he found the old man. At first, Samuel thought he was a bundle of blankets dumped by a passing wagon. Then he saw the feathers tangled in braids, the thin trail of blood drying black against cracked earth. The chief's eyes fluttered open, dark, clouded with pain, but sharp enough to pin Samuel where he stood. He dropped to one knee, fingers hovering over the wound at the man's side. An arrow, broken at the shaft. Too deep to pull out, too deep to heal. Samuel knew death when he saw it. He'd seen it in his wife's pale face, in the hollow bellies of his cattle, in the mirrors he'd smashed one by one when his own reflection became too much to bear. He looked at the old man's hands. They clutched a leather pouch tied tight with a strip of rawhide. Samuel didn't reach for it. Instead, he eased the man's shoulders onto his rolled-up coat, trying not to jostle the arrow. They sat like that in the lowering sun. Two men from different worlds, sharing the silence of a prairie that didn't care for either of them. When the chief spoke, his words were broken, falling from cracked lips in syllables Samuel barely understood, a few phrases in a language he'd picked up trading skins and salted meat years back. What he did grasp was enough. Hill, sacred, rest, family. Samuel knew that hill. A low rise with a lone boulder shaped like a kneeling man, where the grass somehow stayed green longer than anywhere else. He'd seen children scatter stones there in the spring. He figured if the man wanted to die there, who was he to deny it? It took Samuel half the night to drag together an old horse litter, the chief too weak to protest when lifted. The climb up the hill was slow. By the time they reached the top, dawn was threatening to break open the dark, and the old man's breathing had grown shallow, a rattle echoing in the hush before birdsong. Samuel dug with his hands at first, then with a spade he'd brought along, the handle worn smooth by years of mending fences. He laid the old chief into the earth like he'd laid his wife down years before, arms crossed, feathers smoothed, leather pouch resting against his chest. He didn't know the words, so he spoke the only truth he had. May this land treat you kinder than it did me. When the sun finally rose, it found Samuel sitting at the foot of the mound, hat in his hands, dirt under his nails, and a peace in his chest he hadn't felt in a long while. He didn't hear the soft hoofbeats that circled the base of the hill. He didn't see the pair of watchful eyes hidden behind the sagebrush. He only felt the wind change direction, and with it, the weight of something new, something coming, whether he was ready or not. 3 mornings passed before Samuel saw the riders. At first, he thought the haze drifting over his pasture was just the usual dawn mist, but the faint silhouettes that moved through it, low, patient, silent as ghosts, told him otherwise. He stood on his porch, boots planted firm, the butt of his old rifle resting against his thigh, though he made no move to aim it. The men on horseback did not come closer, nor did they signal any intent to cross the fence. They just watched. It was the kind of watching that made the hairs on the back of Samuel's neck prickle, not out of fear exactly, but out of the unspoken understanding that he had stepped into something bigger than himself when he laid that old chief in the ground. By noon, the riders had melted back into the prairie. Samuel went about his chores with the uneasy feeling that every fence post he hammered, every bucket he carried, every hoof he checked, was being weighed and measured by eyes he couldn't see. He found himself glancing up at the hill more than once, half expecting to find the grave disturbed. But the mound remained undisturbed, the fresh grass beginning to creep back over the turned earth. That night, sleep came slow and light. He dreamt of drumming, not the raucous clatter of the town saloon, but a deep, steady heartbeat rolling over the plains. He dreamt of the chief's eyes, open and clear, saying something Samuel couldn't quite make out. When he woke, the fire in the stove had burned itself down to cold embers. He went out to fetch more wood and found the child. The boy stood near the fence line, small and unmoving, wrapped in a blanket too big for his shoulders. Behind him, 3 horses waited. One rider held the reins, another kept watch. Their faces were painted in streaks of ash and ochre, the same colors Samuel remembered seeing on warriors during trading seasons long gone. The eldest among them dismounted, his boots sinking into the dry grass with barely a sound. They did not speak at first. Instead, they looked at him, and then at the boy. The child's eyes were dark as a well, round with a fear so carefully hidden it made Samuel's throat tighten. The man stepped forward, stopping just shy of the fence. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "Morning." The man nodded once. He pressed a hand to his own chest, then gestured to Samuel, a sign of respect or maybe an echo of gratitude Samuel could feel but not name. The elder spoke, the words a quiet blend of English and the older tongue, enough for Samuel to grasp the edge of meaning. "Chief, rest you, it's good burial. Now, child, yours." Samuel blinked. He looked at the boy, then back at the elder, searching for some clue that this was a misunderstanding, a test maybe, or some trick played by the wind and his own loneliness. But the elder's eyes were as serious as the stones on the hill. The other warriors watched in stony silence, their faces unreadable. The boy stepped forward without being told. He clutched a small bundle, a piece of hide, tied with bone beads, smelling faintly of sage. Samuel could see now that beneath the blanket, the child wore a simple buckskin shirt, the cuffs embroidered with tiny colored threads that caught the morning light. "Listen," Samuel began, but the elder was already backing away, mounting up. The boy stayed where he was, staring up at Samuel with a mix of fear and fragile trust that pinned him to the spot more than any gun could have. The riders turned their horses in one smooth motion. No goodbyes, no explanations. They disappeared into the fog, hooves muffled by the dew-wet earth. Samuel stood there, hat in his hand, the boy at his fence line like an answer to a question he'd never asked. Back inside the house, the boy sat at Samuel's kitchen table, the same battered plank where Samuel had eaten alone for years. He didn't touch the bread Samuel offered, but he watched every move the farmer made, tracking him like a cornered animal, not sure if the hunter was done. Samuel poured a cup of water, pushed it toward the boy, then sat across from him. "Don't suppose you've got much English." The boy's lips parted, a whisper. "Name. Kai." Samuel repeated it under his breath. Kai. He looked at the bundle the boy still held tight against his chest. He wondered what was in it. A piece of the chief's hair, maybe, or soil from the hill. A weight of memory he had no right to pry apart. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutters. Samuel found himself wondering how many eyes still watched from the hills, making sure he wouldn't break a promise he hadn't yet agreed to keep. He reached across the table, palm open, slow enough not to spook the boy. Kai's fingers twitched, then rested in his calloused grasp. Small and trembling but warm with a spark of life that hadn't been buried yet. "You hungry?" Samuel asked softly. Kai nodded once. A flicker of trust. A seed of something that could grow if the soil was good, and if Samuel was brave enough to tend it. The first days passed in fits and starts, like a colt too skittish to be broken. Samuel tried to keep to his routines, dawn chores, mending fences, patching the leaky barn roof. But now he did it with a small shadow trailing him, silent and watchful. Sometimes when Samuel turned his back, he'd catch the boy's reflection in a pan of water, eyes wide and unblinking, like a deer waiting for the crack of a rifle. Kai spoke little English, and Samuel spoke no more of the boy's tongue than the handful of trading phrases he'd picked up years ago. So they spoke with gestures, nods, the slow trust that grows not from words but from work, shared in the heat and dust. It was in the garden that Kai first smiled. Samuel had given up on the plot behind the house seasons ago. The soil was rock-hard and refused to yield much more than thistles. But one morning he found Kai kneeling in the dirt, small fingers pressing seeds into shallow rows. The boy hummed under his breath, a low tune that reminded Samuel of wind through dry grass. When Samuel crouched beside him, Kai looked up and pointed to the seeds. He said a word Samuel didn't know, then made a tiny motion with his hand, something sprouting, growing. Samuel scratched his chin. "Well, I'll be damned. If you can coax this dust to life, boy, you're more of a farmer than I'll ever be." They worked side by side that morning. The sun climbed overhead, burning the tops of their ears, but neither minded much. Samuel found himself humming too, though he didn't know the tune. By evening, a neat grid of turned earth lay behind the house, marked with bits of twine and old tin cans to keep the crows away. It was a week before Samuel rode into town. He needed flour, salt, and a few strips of dried meat to keep Kai fed. He left the boy with instructions to stay inside, though he doubted Kai understood every word. As Samuel saddled up his old gelding, he saw a flicker of movement on the ridge, the dark shapes of riders, always watching. He wondered if they'd come down if anything threatened the boy, or him. Harlan's general store sat at the center of town, a weathered sign creaking above the porch steps. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old leather, cured tobacco, and the sharp tang of gossip. Samuel kept his head down, nodding to the shopkeeper, old Will Harlan, whose family had run the place since the first wagon trains came through. Will was polite enough, until he caught the edge of something different in Samuel's eyes. "Been a while since you came down, Sam," Will drawled. He leaned on the counter, peering over his spectacles. "Heard a tale or two. You bury one of them red chiefs out on your land?" Samuel counted out coins, dropping them onto the worn wood with deliberate calm. "Man was dying. Needed burying, that's all." Will snorted. "That's so. Word is his kin left you what did they call it? An heir?" The chatter behind Samuel died down. He could feel eyes pressing into his back, old ranchers, a pair of drifters, a woman with a baby on her hip. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Boy's just a boy. I ain't looking for trouble." Will tapped the coins with a yellowed fingernail. "Trouble don't care if you're looking, Sam. Folks don't like seeing arrangements like that. Could stir up the garrison if they get spooked about tribes sniffing around again." Samuel held his gaze, shoulders squared. "Ain't nobody's business but mine." Will shrugged, bagged the flour, and said no more. But Samuel knew the words would spread faster than prairie fire. By the time he rode back to his homestead, the sun dipping behind the hills, he felt the weight of the stairs still pressing between his shoulder blades. That night, Samuel sat by the stove while Kai curled up on a pile of blankets in the corner. The boys slept light. Every creak of the old floorboards made him stir, eyes wide and wild for a moment, before he settled again. Samuel stared into the flickering flame. He remembered Will's voice, the edge of warning there. He remembered the way the other men had looked at him, like he was a traitor to something they barely understood themselves. He glanced at Kai, the soft rise and fall of the boy's chest, the way his tiny hand still clutched the leather pouch tied with bone beads. He wondered what secrets it held. He wondered if the men in town would ever understand that a grave, a hill, and a promise could bind a man to something bigger than his own fear. He rose, crossed the room, and tugged an old blanket off a nail. Carefully he spread it over Kai, rough hands brushing against the boy's tangled hair. Kai murmured in his sleep, but did not wake. Outside, Samuel heard the distant howl of a coyote, and beneath it, the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats echoing off the hills. The tribe was still there, watching, not ready to trust him fully, but not willing to let him fail alone either. For the first time in years, Samuel felt a fragile warmth grow in the hollow of his chest, like the faint green shoots sprouting in his garden. A hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth tending, even in the dying ground. The garden behind Samuel's house came to life faster than he dared hope. Each morning, Kai was up before dawn, barefoot in the chilled earth, coaxing sprouts from soil so stubborn Samuel used to curse it. Sometimes Samuel watched him from the porch, coffee cup in hand, the sunrise catching on the boy's hair like a promise he didn't yet know how to keep. But beyond the fence line, the prairie carried a different promise, one made of rumor, fear, and men too eager to draw their rifles for a cause they barely understood. It started with a lone rider at dusk. Samuel was feeding the chickens when he heard hooves crunch over gravel. He looked up to see a figure on horseback, a deputy badge catching the last light of the day. It was Jacob Stiller, young, all nerves and wide eyes, but a badge was a badge, and it carried the weight of the garrison's authority. "Evening, Mr. Colton," Stiller called, tipping his hat though he didn't smile. Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers, nodding once. "Deputy." Stiller cleared his throat, glancing at the small figure half hidden behind the porch rail, Kai peeking out, dark eyes round as marbles. "Been talk round town," Stiller said, shifting in the saddle. "Some folks reckon you're harboring an Injun boy, saying maybe the tribe's setting up camp too close for comfort." Samuel rested one boot on the bottom fence rail, his voice even. "The boy stays. He's got no one else." Stiller scratched at his stubbled chin. "Sam, you know how folks get. They start thinking the garrison ought to sweep through. Make sure no war parties hiding out. Some even say you ought to bring the boy in. Protective custody." Samuel felt something cold uncoil in his gut. "So they can send him to one of those missions." His voice hardened. "Not while I'm drawing breath." Stiller's eyes darted to Kai again. He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, Sam, I don't aim to drag the boy off, but you best be careful. Some of the ranchers, they got it in their heads you're sympathizing. Nobody wants to see your place burned up by accident." Samuel held his stare until Stiller looked away. "You done your duty, deputy. I'll take it from here." Without another word, Stiller tugged the reins and rode off into the gathering dusk. Samuel stood there until the hoofbeats faded. When he turned, Kai was still by the porch rail, clutching the edge of his blanket. That night, Samuel bolted the door. He kept the rifle loaded by the table. Kai didn't ask questions, he didn't have the words for them yet. But when Samuel sat by the stove, the boy crept closer, laying his small bundle, the leather pouch, the bone beads, in Samuel's lap, as if to say, "This is all I have. It's yours now, too." They slept lightly. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying faint echoes of distant drumming, or maybe just the old wooden boards creaking in protest. Samuel lay awake, replaying Stiller's warning in his head until the fire burned down to coals. Trouble came before dawn. Not with an army, but with the slow, measured tread of boots on dry earth. Samuel was tending the stock when he saw them. 3 men on foot, rifles slung across their shoulders. He recognized one, Nate Harrow, a rancher with a mean streak and a mouth that liked to stir up fear. The other 2 were younger, faces hard with the tension of boys trying to play at being dangerous. Nate stopped just inside the fence, boots scuffing dust into the morning air. "Morning, Colton," he drawled, eyes flicking to Kai, who stood frozen near the barn door. "Heard tell you been keeping company with our red neighbors." Samuel didn't rise to the bait. "You come to trespass or you got something to say?" Nate's grin was slow and sharp. "Got nothing against you personally, Sam. Just thinking maybe you ought to hand the boy over. Let the army deal with him. Keep the peace, you know." Samuel stepped forward, boots crunching over brittle grass. "The boy stays." "That's the end of it." One of Nate's men shifted his rifle, not raising it but making damn sure Samuel saw the shine of the barrel. The air seemed to tighten, dry and thin as paper about to catch flame. Kai's breath hitched. Without thinking, the boy slipped behind Samuel, small hand clinging to the rough hem of his coat. Samuel could feel the tremor in his grip, a child's fear trying to stand tall. Nate laughed low in his throat. "Reckon you think you're a hero burying their chief. Now you want to be a father to one too. Ain't your fight, Sam." Samuel's voice dropped, iron under the dust. "You're standing on my land. He's standing under my roof. That makes him mine to protect." The standoff stretched like an unspoken dare. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Samuel caught movement on the ridge. Shapes. Horses. The same silent shadows that had been there since the burial. Closer now. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Nate followed his gaze and stiffened. "Watching you," Nate spat. "Don't think they'll stay polite forever." Samuel took another step forward, jaw tight. "And don't think I will, neither." Nate snorted, spat into the dust, and jerked his head at his men. "Come on. Ain't worth dying over an Injun brat." They slunk back toward town, boots crunching through dry grass. Samuel stayed rooted until their figures shrank to specks on the horizon. Only then did he feel the boy's hand loosen its grip on his coat. Samuel turned, kneeling so he was eye level with Kai. He rested a rough hand on the boy's shoulder, felt the thin bones, the fragile life pulsing under his palm. "You don't worry about them," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "Ain't nobody taking you from me." Kai blinked up at him, a flash of trust, deeper than words, stronger than any promise Samuel had ever made. On the ridge the riders watched, unmoving shadows under the rising sun, a silent pact that the farmer was not alone, so long as he remembered what that meant. The next days passed in a brittle hush. Samuel felt the threat like a thorn under his skin, not sharp enough to bleed, but impossible to ignore. He doubled the chores, moved the cattle closer to the barn, checked the locks on the windows 3 times before sleeping. But no lock was strong enough against men whose fear outpaced their sense. Kai stayed close, shadowing Samuel from dawn to dusk. He hardly spoke, but in the small moments, handing Samuel a spade, sweeping the porch with careful strokes, the boy's quiet presence settled Samuel's heart in ways he didn't dare name out loud. It was the hush that made the roar hit harder. They came at night, when the moon was a thin sickle, and the wind carried the scent of old ashes. Samuel woke to the acrid bite of smoke in his nostrils, the soft crackle that made every bone in his body go cold. He stumbled from his bed, grabbing the rifle. Kai was already awake, eyes wide in the shadows, clutching his leather pouch to his chest. "Stay here," Samuel barked, though the boy's terror said he would not move anyway. Outside, flames licked at the edges of the barn. Someone had thrown torches through the hayloft window. Dry straw caught like tinder. His cattle kicked and screamed in their pens, hooves thudding against half-rotten wood. Through the veil of smoke he saw them, shadows darting between fence posts, rough laughter carried on the wind. He caught a glimpse of Nate Harrow's broad hat, the glint of a rifle barrel, a whiskey bottle swinging in someone's hand. Samuel fired a warning shot into the air. "You sons of bitches, get off my land!" A bottle shattered against the fence, fire blooming where it landed. A second torch sailed through the dark, landing too close to the garden Kai had coaxed to life. Samuel cursed, aiming again, but a shot cracked back, a warning that they were armed and eager. Behind him, he felt Kai's small hand grip the back of his coat. He turned, crouching low. "Listen to me, boy. You run for the hill. If anything happens to me, you go there. Understand? The riders'll find you." Kai's eyes glistened with panic, but he shook his head. "No. You." Samuel grabbed his shoulder. "Do it." But the boy didn't move. Instead, Kai did the last thing Samuel expected. He darted past him toward the garden. Samuel spun around in time to see the boy stamp out a creeping line of fire with his bare feet, slapping at flames with his blanket. He was so small against the blaze, but he didn't run. Samuel's breath caught. Fear, fury, a rush of something he hadn't felt since the day he'd buried his wife. The bone-deep terror of losing someone you weren't ready to lose. A gunshot cracked too close. Samuel wheeled, fired once, scattering the shadows. From the ridge came an answer. Not gunfire, but a call like an owl's cry echoing across the dry hills. Samuel didn't dare take his eyes off the flames, but he felt it. The air shifting, the way prey goes still when the wolves arrive. Moments later, the shapes emerged. Silent. Riders in paint and feathers, sliding between the fence posts like ghosts. The ranchers never saw them coming until they were there. Blades at throats, rifle stocks cracking against jaws, a fury that needed no words. One of Nate's men stumbled backward into the garden, face bloodied. Kai stood his ground, small hands balled into fists as if he might fight grown men with nothing but his will. Samuel scooped him up with one arm, rifle still ready in the other. He heard Nate shouting curses until a rider on a painted horse reared up before him, eyes blazing with something older than any lawman's badge. Nate dropped his gun. In the flickering light, Samuel saw fear pour out of the man like sweat. By dawn, the barn was gone, a charred ribcage against the horizon. A few cattle lay dead where the fence had broken, but most had scattered into the prairie. The garden, miraculously, still held its shape, trampled in places, but not burned to nothing. The riders lingered just outside the ring of ash. One by one they dismounted, forming a loose circle around Samuel and Kai. No weapons drawn now, only solemn eyes, nods of respect. One elder stepped forward, placing a hand on Samuel's chest, right over his heart. He spoke low, words Samuel could not fully understand, but the meaning rang clear. "You are one of us now, keeper of the boy, keeper of the promise." Kai leaned into Samuel's side, exhausted but unbroken. Samuel looked down at the boy's soot-smeared feet, the small fingers still wrapped tight around that old leather pouch. He had lost his barn, a dozen cattle, and the last shred of peace he'd managed to keep from the world. But in its place stood something he'd never had, not since the earth claimed his wife and the sky refused him children of his own. He squeezed Kai's shoulder, eyes flicking to the riders on the ridge. For the first time, he did not feel like a man watched. He felt like a man seen. The wind carried the smell of burned timber for days. Samuel spent dawn to dusk hauling what was left of the barn out to the field, piling charred boards and broken beams in neat stacks that he'd burn when the ground was ready. The cattle that survived wandered at the edges of the fence line, skittish, half wild from the fire and the noise. There were fewer of them now, but Samuel knew how to work with less. He always had. Kai worked beside him. The boy had no words for what had happened, not in English, not even in the songs he hummed while digging new furrows in the garden, but he carried himself differently now, shoulders squared, eyes older than they had any right to be. Every night, Samuel sat on the porch, boots planted firm on the top step, rifle resting across his knees. The tribe's riders still watched from the hills, but they no longer kept themselves hidden. Sometimes Samuel saw them standing at the edge of his fields, horses cropping the tall grass, heads bowed as if they were counting his losses along with him. They came no closer, nor did they need to. He understood now. They were there not just for Kai, but for the man who had dug a grave for their chief and lit a fire in the dark to protect their last hope. By midsummer, the garden Kai planted began to bloom, tomatoes clinging to their vines, stubborn patches of corn pushing skyward like they believed in the rain that never came. Samuel built a makeshift pen from the scraps of his burned barn, just enough to hold the scrawny calf that had wandered back home 2 nights after the fire. It felt like a small victory in a season that offered so few. One evening, he found Kai kneeling at the base of the sacred hill. The boy had carried a handful of corn stalks there, laying them down in a rough circle on the mound where the chief rested. Samuel stood back, hat in hand, watching the way Kai pressed his palm to the dirt, a child's prayer, silent and stubborn as the prairie itself. He walked up the slope, boots crunching over dry grass. "You reckon he hears you, boy?" Kai looked up, eyes bright in the dying light. He touched his chest, then pointed to the earth. "Here," he whispered, "always here." Samuel crouched beside him. He didn't have the words for what he felt, a hollow place filling up slow as rain in a dry well. So he laid his big, rough hand over Kai's small one, pressing both palms to the sun-warmed soil. Word of what happened spread farther than the smoke ever did. Some in town still called Samuel a fool, a traitor. Some whispered that the farm would be cursed, that he'd brought savage eyes too close to their picket fences and church doors. But others, the quiet ones, started to send small kindnesses. A sack of beans left by his gate, a coil of rope when they saw his fences leaning. Not everyone was ready to stand with him in the open, but a few understood what it meant to keep a promise, even when the cost came due. And when those same garrison men rode by in the weeks that followed, boots heavy with suspicion, eyes scanning his hills for signs of an uprising, they found Samuel standing at his fence line, rifle slung over his shoulder, the boy at his side. They never crossed his land. They never asked where the tribe had gone. By the time the prairie grass turned gold and brittle at summer's end, the outline of a new barn stood behind Samuel's house. Not finished, not by half, but framed enough to catch the morning light in the gaps between rough boards. Samuel let Kai hammer in the nails, guiding the boy's small hands with his own, patient even when the hammer missed its mark. At night, they ate together at the battered kitchen table, one cracked bowl shared between them when supplies ran thin. Sometimes Kai would speak to him in the language Samuel didn't know, repeating a word until Samuel could shape it on his tongue. Siki's brother, Nashdoi, friend. Samuel taught him English words too, shovel, fence, harvest. He caught the boy laughing when he stumbled over the tribal syllables, the sound so pure it made the long nights feel short again. One morning, long after the ashes had been scattered and the town's rumors had drifted to silence, Samuel took Kai up to the sacred hill. They stood by the mound hand in hand. The wind tugged at their sleeves like a child wanting to be noticed. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Samuel asked, voice low. "Me neither." Kai just smiled. He untied the leather pouch from around his neck, the same one he'd clutched that first day, and pressed it into Samuel's palm. Inside was a small bundle of sage, a bead carved from bone, and a twist of hair black as crow feathers. Samuel looked at the boy, then at the grave. He understood then. Some promises weren't made to be carried alone. Some were seeds that took root in other men's hands. He closed his fist around the pouch. "We'll keep it safe, boy. Both of us." The prairie stretched endless before them, dry, vast, uncaring. But where they stood, the earth felt different. like something worth defending, worth tending, even when the fences rotted and the cattle wandered away, even when the world forgot their names. A solitary farmer buried a dying chief. Days later, he became guardian of the tribe's last heir, and in the long hush of the plains that promise grew roots no fire could burn away.